I remember the day my world cracked open, even though it looked so ordinary at first. The sky was overcast, the house was quiet, and I was sitting in the living room with my fiancé, Mark, going over last-minute wedding details. My mother had just called to ask if we needed extra chairs for distant relatives, and I felt that mixture of excitement and nerves that every bride knows too well. There was a strange heaviness in the air, though, something intangible I couldn't name. Then my sister, Rachel, sent me a single text message. "We need to talk." At the time, I didn't think much of it. We hadn't spoken properly for a while, but I assumed she wanted to discuss the seating arrangement or share some sisterly advice. Mark and I had no idea how drastically everything would change after that call. Even now, I can still picture the anxious flutter in my stomach when I heard her voice on the other end. Her tone was clipped, urgent, and lacking the warmth I'd always associated with her. It was the first sign that something was deeply off and that my wedding, just days away, would never be the same. I remember thinking she must be in trouble or maybe fighting with her husband. She and Tom had seemed happy once, but rumors had been swirling for months that their relationship was on the rocks. I just never imagined how she would drag me into it or blame me for something unthinkable. When I finally sat down to call her back, my heart pounded uncomfortably. I still remember glancing at Mark, who offered me an encouraging smile, but something in me tightened like a coiled spring. Rachel answered on the second ring and jumped straight to the point. She didn't ask about my wedding plans or discuss what color dress she'd wear as my maid of honor. Instead, she calmly stated that Tom had filed for divorce and she wanted me to admit my role in it. I recall the immediate protest rising in my throat. My role? I had none. I couldn't fathom what she was implying, so I demanded she explain. That was when she dropped the bomb. She claimed Tom had left her because of an affair he believed I'd been having with him. The shock was like a physical blow. At first, I laughed in disbelief because it seemed so ridiculous. Tom was my brother-in-law, a man I respected but rarely even saw outside of family gatherings. I asked how anyone could possibly believe something so insane, but Rachel was utterly serious. She insisted Tom confess to her that I had seduced him, leading to irreconcilable problems in their marriage. I thought it was a sick joke, yet her voice trembled with hurt and accusation, and I realized she truly believed, or claimed to believe, this twisted narrative. I ended the call feeling dizzy, outraged, and deeply wounded. It was the first time in my life that I felt genuinely betrayed by my own sister. I spent the next 2 days frantically trying to fix the mess she'd created. I called Tom, who didn't answer. I texted him, left voicemails. Nothing. Meanwhile, my mother and father started getting cryptic phone calls from Rachel, where she said I had confessed everything. Suddenly, my phone was exploding with messages from uncles, aunts, and cousins who were horrified that I could do such a thing. My parents were initially skeptical, until Rachel sent them a barrage of fabricated text screenshots, supposedly proving I'd been flirting with Tom for months. None of those messages were real. I'd never sent them, but Rachel was cunning enough to piece together old threads or alter them with new technology. Slowly, I realized I was battling a rumor war orchestrated by my own sister. My mother left me a hysterical voicemail telling me she couldn't face relatives if I went through with the wedding after committing such a sin. My father, always the more stoic one, told me he needed some time to think about whether he could even walk me down the aisle. Everything was spiraling out of control. Mark was furious and wanted to confront Rachel in person, but I convinced him to wait. I still believed, foolishly, that the truth would come out soon. I was wrong. Each day, more people from my extended family sided with Rachel. She was crying about her broken marriage, about how Tom had left her in tears, about how I had supposedly crept into their life like a saboteur. I felt like I was living someone else's nightmare, a horrifying story penned by a vengeful spirit. Yet, it was very real, and the wedding day was racing toward me with unstoppable momentum. I tried reasoning with my parents in person. I drove 2 hours to their house, thinking that if I looked them in the eyes, they'd see the truth. When I arrived, my mother was in tears, muttering about how she never raised us to be so cruel. My father, arms crossed, said he was disappointed and ashamed. They demanded I apologize to Rachel. I refused. How could I apologize for something I didn't do? I offered to show them my phone records, social media accounts, anything to prove my innocence. But Rachel had gotten to them first, brandishing her doctored evidence. My mother screamed at me for forging phone logs when I revealed them. My father turned his back, refusing to even look at my explanations. I begged them to consider that Rachel might be lying, but they saw her as the wounded victim. After all, Tom had left the house. She'd been the one crying in their arms. In their eyes, I was the unscrupulous sister who had destroyed a sacred union. I still remember the heartbreak of that moment, standing in my childhood home, once filled with memories of birthdays and holiday gatherings, now echoing with resentment and disbelief. Finally, I told them I was still getting married, with or without their blessing. My mother burst into another round of tears, and my father declared he wouldn't attend. I left that day feeling both furious and utterly alone. In the days leading up to my wedding, I found out that almost my entire family was planning to boycott. Even my favorite aunt, who'd always been warm and loving, canceled at the last minute. Rachel had spun her story so effectively that only a handful of relatives dared to show up. Mark's family, however, stood firmly by our side. They believed me, had no reason not to, and offered their unwavering support. Mark himself was the rock I clung to, though I knew the strain was getting to him too. Who wants to marry into a family at war with itself? On the day of the ceremony, I walked down the aisle without my father. A close friend stood in for him. My mother was absent, and I refused to look at the empty seats where my parents should have been. I kept my chin up, determined not to let Rachel's lies tarnish the vows I was about to make. When Mark and I said "I do," it was a bittersweet moment. I was marrying the love of my life, yet a huge part of me felt hollow, as if the people who had shaped my identity had vanished into thin air. The reception was smaller than planned, but surprisingly joyful. Friends toasted us, promising that truth would prevail. I took comfort in their optimism, though in the back of my mind I doubted my family would come around quickly. Rachel's betrayal ran deep, and I knew the damage might be permanent. After the wedding, life settled into a tense routine. Mark and I moved to a new apartment across town, hoping the distance would help us start fresh. For a while, we focused on each other, ignoring the ongoing family drama. We hosted dinner parties for friends, explored new hobbies, and talked about starting a family. Yet, whenever my phone chimed, my pulse raced, afraid of more attacks from Rachel or disapproving messages from our parents. Weeks turned into months, and I eventually learned that Rachel and Tom's divorce had been finalized. Tom was rumored to have moved to another state, though I never heard the full story. Despite my repeated attempts to contact him and clarify the truth, he never responded. Perhaps he was too ashamed or simply didn't care. Meanwhile, Rachel posted cryptic updates on social media about betrayal and heartbreak, continuing to paint me as the villain. My parents invited her to Sunday dinners while I remained excluded. Sometimes I contemplated driving to their house just to show up unannounced, but I was tired of banging my head against the wall. If they wanted to believe Rachel's lies, so be it. Mark supported my decision to cut ties for my own sanity. I still had nightmares about it all, dreams where my parents looked at me with disgust, or where Rachel smirked triumphantly as I stood in a torn wedding gown. It was exhausting, but I was determined to move forward. A year later, I discovered I was pregnant. The news filled me with a cautious joy, tempered by the ache of knowing my parents wouldn't be part of the celebration. Still, Mark and I were thrilled, and we started preparing for our new arrival. One evening, as I was browsing baby names, my phone rang. It was my mother. I stared at the screen, unsure whether to answer. We hadn't spoken since before my wedding, over a year of silence, blame, and heartbreak. Curiosity got the better of me. I pressed accept. She congratulated me on the pregnancy, her voice tentative, as though trying not to scare me off. My father was on speaker, but he barely said a word. Their tone was conciliatory, even apologetic, which immediately made me suspicious. Then my mother brought up Rachel. She explained that Rachel had been trying to have a baby for months, but found out she was infertile. "It's devastating news," my mother lamented. "Rachel's taken it so hard, especially after losing Tom. We were hoping you could share your baby with her." My jaw dropped. I asked her to clarify. My mother, with my father's faint murmur of agreement in the background, said they wanted me to consider letting Rachel adopt my child or at least co-parent so Rachel could experience motherhood. I was so stunned I couldn't speak. After all the lies Rachel told, after the wedding boycott, and after they basically abandoned me, they wanted my child to soothe her pain? The audacity left me trembling with fury. I hung up on them. Seconds later, the phone rang again, but I ignored it. My mother left a voicemail, urging me to think it over for the sake of family unity. She insisted that if I did this one thing, it would mend all the wounds. I sat there, nauseated by the thought of sharing my baby with the very woman who had destroyed my reputation. Mark came home to find me pacing the living room, still clutching the phone. When I told him what happened, he looked as though he couldn't decide whether to laugh or punch a hole in the wall. The nerve of my parents was unbelievable. They had chosen Rachel's side, shattered my wedding, then conveniently resurfaced now that I had something she wanted. Their attempt to guilt me into giving up my child was beyond monstrous. Over the following weeks, the calls continued. My mother's messages escalated from polite pleas to emotional blackmail. She claimed that if I truly cared about Rachel's well-being, I would share the miracle of motherhood. My father chimed in once or twice, grumbling that I owed it to the family to help my sister start over. Each time, I felt more enraged, but also more resolute in my refusal. I decided not to respond anymore. Their manipulative words made it easy to see just how twisted their priorities had become. That's when Rachel herself showed up at my doorstep. I was 6 months pregnant and feeling drained from work. Mark was still at the office. When the doorbell rang, I glanced through the peephole and nearly slammed the door in her face. But she started yelling loudly enough for the neighbors to hear, so I opened it a crack. She looked disheveled, her eyes red-rimmed and her hair unkempt, as though she hadn't slept in days. Without waiting for an invitation, she pushed past me into the living room. I demanded she leave, but she sank onto the couch, pleading with me to listen. She said she regretted how things had turned out between us. She even hinted that Tom might have lied to her, though she never outright admitted she'd fabricated the cheating story. Then she started sobbing about how cruel life was, how she couldn't have a baby of her own, and how seeing me pregnant felt like a knife to her heart. I stood there, my hand protectively over my belly, feeling nothing but a cold anger. She had ruined my wedding, turned my family against me, and never once apologized. Now she wanted me to give her a piece of my happiness to fill the void she'd created. I let her talk until she was out of breath. Then, in the quiet that followed, I told her that I was done. Done with her lies, her drama, and the audacity of expecting I'd hand over my child. Her tears dried up quickly, replaced by a steely glare that reminded me just how ruthless she could be. Rachel's face twisted with rage as she accused me of being selfish. She even tried to guilt-trip me by invoking childhood memories, how I used to share my toys, how I was always protective of her. Now, she insisted, I was abandoning her in her greatest time of need. I laughed bitterly, reminding her that she had abandoned me first, peddling lies that cost me my family and ruined my wedding day. She slapped the couch cushion in frustration. In that moment, she looked ready to tear the entire place apart. Then, in a move so brazen it left me speechless, she demanded I let her adopt my baby once it was born, or else she'd make sure our parents never forgave me. I stared at her, a wave of adrenaline flooding my veins. Was she actually threatening me? My maternal instinct flared like a wildfire. Nobody was going to take my child from me, least of all the woman who had torpedoed my reputation. I told her to get out. When she refused, I grabbed my phone and threatened to call the police. That finally got her on her feet. She stormed to the door, spat out something about how I'd regret this, and slammed it behind her. My heart was pounding so violently I had to sit down. I knew then that the rift between us was permanent. She had declared war, and I wasn't about to surrender. Not this time. Mark arrived shortly after, and I recounted the entire confrontation. He held me in his arms and told me we'd do whatever it took to protect our family. That night, we agreed on a plan. We would take legal precautions. First, we installed a security system. Then we consulted a lawyer who advised us to document every harassing message or threat. If Rachel or my parents tried anything, we would have proof. My pregnancy was stressful enough without this drama, but we felt safer knowing we were taking steps to safeguard our future. A couple of weeks passed, and I heard little from Rachel or my parents. I began to relax, hoping maybe they had finally accepted my decision. But then, one morning, my mother showed up unannounced. She was carrying a bag of baby items, onesies, blankets, tiny socks, and wearing a forced smile. She tried to come inside, cooing about how a grandmother has rights. I blocked her at the threshold, reminding her that she'd forfeited those rights when she chose to believe Rachel's lies over my truth. She teared up, claiming she was just trying to make amends, but I saw through her. She'd always been easily manipulated by Rachel's sob stories. Despite my anger, part of me ached for the mother I once knew, but I couldn't let nostalgia cloud my judgment. I told her to leave and not to return unless she could respect my boundaries. Eventually, I went into labor. The birth was difficult, but Mark was my rock, and we welcomed a healthy baby boy we named Alexander. In the postpartum haze of exhaustion and wonder, I felt a powerful surge of love and protectiveness. Holding Alexander for the first time was like anchoring myself to a new reality, one where I was fiercely determined to protect my child from toxic influences, even if those influences were blood relatives. It was almost 2 weeks before I informed anyone in my family that Alexander had arrived. When my parents found out, they demanded to meet him. Rachel, too, sent messages claiming she deserved to see her nephew. I ignored them all. My focus was on recovering and bonding with my son. Then, late one evening, my father called. He said he was outside my building. I nearly panicked, thinking he'd forced his way in. Mark went downstairs to handle it. I watched from the window, heart hammering, as my father pleaded with Mark in the parking lot. Eventually, Mark came back and said Dad looked genuinely remorseful, begging for a chance to meet his grandson. After a long discussion, we decided to allow a brief visit under strict conditions. Dad came up, sat on the edge of the couch, and quietly asked to hold Alexander. I let him, but not without reminding him of the boundaries. He cried silently as he rocked the baby in his arms. For a fleeting moment, I saw the father I once adored, the man who taught me how to ride a bike and cooked pancakes on Sunday mornings. That moment of vulnerability shattered when he started making excuses for Rachel. He murmured something about how she'd been confused during her divorce, how Tom might have misled her, how she'd just lashed out in desperation. I stiffened. It always came back to them defending her. When he suggested it would be nice if Rachel could at least see Alexander, I stood up and took my baby from him. In a calm but firm voice, I told him I would never allow Rachel near my child. I reminded him how she had lied about me, destroyed my wedding, and threatened me in my own living room. I asked if he'd forgotten those humiliations. My father lowered his head, silent. After a moment, he got up to leave. He glanced back with teary eyes, but he didn't argue anymore. As the door clicked shut, I felt a complex blend of sadness and triumph. I was sad to watch my father go, but triumphant that I hadn't caved to their manipulative demands. From then on, Mark and I decided to move forward without my family. We wanted Alexander to grow up in a loving environment, free from the toxicity that had poisoned so much of my past. But the story doesn't end there. One day, while scrolling social media, I saw a post from Rachel, pictures of a baby, along with a caption about a blessing finally bestowed. My stomach dropped. Was she claiming to have a child now? Something felt off. I clicked on her profile and found more photos, all of them suspiciously lacking clarity. Then I recognized a blanket pattern, one identical to a gift my mother had once mentioned buying for me. I felt an icy chill. Was Rachel implying that my baby was hers? Enraged, I confronted my parents over the phone. They denied any knowledge, but I could sense my mother's voice shaking when she said Rachel must be posting old pictures from a friend's newborn. It made no sense, and I was certain something sinister was going on. My lawyer advised me to document everything. Then I started receiving messages from acquaintances congratulating me on letting Rachel adopt my child. I nearly threw my phone across the room in outrage. That was when I realized Rachel was spreading a new lie, that she and I had come to a peaceful agreement where she would become Alexander's adoptive mother or co-parent. My fury reached a boiling point. We tightened our security, blocked anyone who spread that rumor, and prepared for a legal fight if it escalated. Yet, even as the months passed, Rachel kept posting vague references to her son, fueling confusion among distant relatives who weren't aware of the real story. A cousin even called to scold me for not letting Rachel visit her baby. I set the record straight in no uncertain terms, warning that I'd sue anyone who aided Rachel in her deceit. The drama was exhausting, but I refused to be a victim again. If Rachel wanted to pretend, I'd let her. It was a pathetic fantasy, but it was powerless as long as she had no legal claim. As Alexander grew, I sent occasional updates to my father, telling him that if he could respect our boundaries, he might see his grandson again. Rachel, however, would remain persona non grata in our lives. I made that crystal clear. My father said he understood, but I didn't fully trust him. 2 years later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, I got an unexpected letter from Tom. Yes, the same Tom who had vanished after divorcing Rachel. His handwriting was shaky, and the envelope carried a return address from another state. Inside was an apology so raw it took me several minutes to absorb. He admitted that Rachel had concocted the affair story out of desperation to shift blame for their failing marriage. He wrote that he had never wanted me implicated, but had felt cornered by Rachel's emotional manipulation. His confession was everything I needed to finally clear my name in the eyes of anyone still doubting me. With Tom's written statement in hand, I had the ultimate weapon. I scanned his letter, typed up a thorough account of the real events, and mailed copies to my parents, extended family, and close friends. I included the vile messages Rachel had sent me about adopting my baby, along with Tom's letter, as irrefutable proof of her deceit. The backlash against Rachel was swift. Suddenly, those relatives who had called me a homewrecker realized they'd been supporting a liar. My parents were humiliated. They called me, sobbing, apologizing profusely. I told them that while they were free to seek my forgiveness, I would never forget their choice to abandon me when I needed them most. I cut the conversation short, refusing their pleas for a meeting. As for Rachel, she tried to spin the narrative yet again, claiming Tom's letter was fake, that I was forging more evidence. But this time, no one believed her. She had cried wolf too many times. Her social media turned into a war zone of accusations and defenses, eventually forcing her to disappear from most platforms. In an almost comedic twist, she lost her job when her employer discovered she'd been using company resources to doctor evidence. The last I heard, she moved back in with my parents, too disgraced to show her face in town. I can't deny the satisfaction I felt watching her world crumble. After all the pain she inflicted, seeing her lies exposed was the sweetest revenge. And I found no pity in my heart for her. She had tried to steal my joy, wreck my wedding, and even claim my child as her own. Her downfall felt like justice served. As for me, I continued building a life filled with love and resilience. Mark and I eventually bought a small house with a big backyard, perfect for Alexander to run around in. I steered clear of family gatherings, only maintaining a cautious, limited contact with my father who occasionally visited his grandson. My mother tried to repair our bond, but each time she stepped toward me, I recalled how she'd asked me to hand over my baby to Rachel. That wound would never truly heal. In the end, I learned that self-respect means setting boundaries so firm that no one's lies can breach them. I didn't need to forgive Rachel to move on. I just needed to watch her deception unravel and claim my own sense of peace. Life didn't magically become perfect, but it became authentically mine, free from the toxic ties that once strangled me. When I look at Alexander giggling on the swings or chasing fireflies at dusk, I'm reminded of the moment I chose my family, my husband, my child, and myself, over the guilt trips of people who were supposed to protect me but instead believed the worst. I have no regrets. Perhaps that's the most unpredictable ending of all. The day I finally found peace wasn't when my family asked for forgiveness, but when I decided they no longer had the power to hurt me.